In the summer of 1956, Britain still spoke in the grammar of empire. It had evacuated some old positions, yes, and it had lost some of the easy arrogance that came before the Second World War, but the habits of command remained. The Suez Canal still sat at the center of its strategic imagination, not simply as a waterway on a map, but as an artery. It connected Britain to its remaining overseas possessions. It carried oil from the Middle East into Western Europe. It stood for prestige, reach, and the idea that London could still shape events east of Gibraltar with a combination of naval memory, diplomatic pressure, and the occasional show of force. Anthony Eden, heir to Churchill in style if not in stature, looked out at that world and still saw a power with obligations, with levers, with authority. Then Gamal Abdel Nasser seized the Canal Company, and suddenly the imperial vocabulary sounded old. Britain answered with plans, with allies, with aircraft, with paratroopers. It prepared Operation Musketeer as if the world had not changed. For a brief moment, it even seemed to work. Egyptian airfields were hit, Port Said was entered. Israeli forces advanced across Sinai. The old imperial machine still moved. But underneath the gunboats and communiques sat something weaker than the British state liked to admit. The empire could still land troops. It just could not afford a run on sterling, and in that gap between military force and financial dependence, the modern world announced itself with cold precision. The whole drama can be narrowed, if only for a moment, to one stark image. Not a battleship in the canal, not a parachute over Port Said, but a phone call to Washington as sterling came under growing pressure and Britain needed financial support. One later summary of the crisis put it brutally. As sterling was sold in increasing quantities, Chancellor Harold Macmillan phoned his American counterpart and learned that American backing for an IMF loan would come only if Britain withdrew immediately. That is the kind of detail historians cherish because it shrinks an empire into a sentence. On one end of the line, Britain still had divisions, bases, ministers, and illusions. On the other, the United States had something more modern and more decisive in that moment, the ability to withhold rescue. So this story is not really about one canal. It is about the weekend when the question changed. Not whether Britain could invade Egypt. It could. Not whether it could win the first moves on the battlefield. It did. The real question was whether a country could still behave like an empire after it had become financially dependent on someone else. And if it could not, what exactly remained? The military story of Suez is dramatic enough, but the financial story is what gives it its weight. The numbers are not glamorous. They rarely are. Yet they explain why the operation collapsed so quickly. A State Department memorandum from late November 1956 described the British position in unmistakably economic terms, warning of a tight financial squeeze. In just 1 week, Britain lost $102 million in gold and dollar reserves. Those were not abstract accounting entries. They were the hard currency buffers defending the pound. After that week, total reserves stood at just over $2 billion. At the very moment Britain was trying to look formidable abroad, its financial armor was visibly thinning. The same memorandum warned that November losses in gold and dollar reserves were likely to exceed $200 million. It also listed another problem that made the crisis even nastier. Disrupted oil supplies would force Britain to increase purchases of dollar oil by $225 million over the next 6 months. In other words, the war was not merely politically costly. It was making Britain buy more expensive fuel in the very currency it was trying to conserve. Then came the bills already due. Britain faced $190 million in interest and principal payments in December on American and Canadian loans, plus roughly $5 million more on smaller ECA obligations. That is how empires discover the future, not in a speech, in a maturity schedule. This was the structural weakness beneath the swagger. Britain still had a global currency, but that was as much danger as privilege. Economic historian Alec Klug argues that during Suez, Britain was more vulnerable than France, partly because sterling was virtually convertible. That mattered. A reserve currency is not just a badge, it is a promise. It says outsiders can exit, and when they decide to exit all at once, patriotism does not stop them. Markets do not care about imperial nostalgia. They care about confidence, liquidity, and whether the authorities can hold the line. Klug's work also notes that the Bank of England spent about $30 million on direct support of transferable sterling during the crisis. a sign that officials were actively trying to keep the market from turning a political gamble into a currency collapse. Meanwhile, IMF historian James Boughton later described Suez as a financial crisis as well as a geopolitical one. According to the IMF account, Macmillan would have to announce a net November reserve loss of $279 million, pushing Britain's balance below the $2 billion mark. Another summary of the crisis records him telling cabinet that $280 million of foreign exchange reserves had been lost in the previous week. This is what collapse looks like in a modern great power. Not a foreign army in London, a shrinking reserve line, a currency under speculative attack, and ministers counting days instead of territories. The rhythm of the crisis makes the point even harder. On July 26, 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, the joint British-French enterprise that had owned and operated the canal since the 19th century. Britain and France feared not only the loss of a strategic asset but a humiliating demonstration that their regional influence could be openly defied. The roots were already there. The United States and Britain had agreed to help finance the first stage of the Aswan High Dam, with Britannica noting a figure of $270 million, before Washington canceled the offer on July 20 and London followed the next day. 5 days later, Nasser declared the canal nationalized and promised that tolls collected over 5 years would pay for the dam. The symbolism was irresistible. He was taking a colonial instrument and turning it into a national development fund. For London, that looked less like bookkeeping than rebellion with accounting attached. Diplomatic efforts failed. The United States tried to broker a settlement and proposed the Suez Canal Users Association, but no arrangement satisfied all sides. Behind the scenes, Britain and France turned to Israel. On October 29, according to Britannica, 10 Israeli brigades invaded Egypt and advanced toward the canal. Britain and France then issued demands and launched their own intervention under the pretext of separating the combatants. It was a clever script on paper. In the real world, almost no one believed it. By early November, British and French troops had landed at Port Said and Port Fouad. The operation had tactical competence. The politics were catastrophic. Around the world, the landings looked exactly like what they were widely assumed to be. Former colonial powers using force to reverse an Arab nationalist challenge. The timing could hardly have been worse. The Soviet Union was crushing the Hungarian uprising at the same moment, and the Eisenhower administration had no intention of denouncing Soviet violence in Eastern Europe while appearing to excuse Anglo-French violence in Egypt. The State Department's own milestone history is explicit that Washington pressured Britain and France to accept a United Nations ceasefire on November 6 and voted for UN resolutions condemning the invasion. The Imperial War Museum goes further in describing the domestic impact inside Britain. On November 4, the UN threatened sanctions if there were civilian casualties from British aerial bombing, and this led to economic panic in the first week of November, with tens of millions of pounds lost from the country's reserves. Britain, the museum notes, faced having to devalue its currency. That phrase matters, not because devaluation was inevitable, but because the threat alone was enough to bring the whole operation into a different light. Once a government begins an overseas war and ends by worrying about its exchange rate, it is no longer writing the old imperial script. It is reading from a balance sheet. And that is why the American position was so devastating even without a single U.S. soldier firing a shot. Washington did not need to invade Britain. It needed only to make clear that financial relief would not be divorced from political compliance. A State Department memorandum warned other officials of the dangers of inaction and the need to prepare to act promptly when a British request came. That is cautious bureaucratic language, but it tells us something important. American officials understood that Britain's weakness was financial and immediate. The Imperial War Museum, in its public summary, states bluntly that Eisenhower put pressure on the IMF to deny Britain assistance. Diane Kuntz, in her study of the crisis, defines the whole episode as one of economic diplomacy, the use of financial leverage to alter state behavior. That sounds dry until one remembers the context. Britain had troops on the ground, it had aircraft in the sky. And yet the decisive pressure was being applied through reserves, credit, and international institutions. The empire was not defeated by a stronger army on the battlefield. It was cornered by the modern hierarchy of money. If there is one man who helps humanize this entire mechanism, it is Nasser. Before he became the face of Arab nationalism, he was a boy moving through Egypt with his father, who worked in the postal service. Britannica describes him taking part in anti-British street demonstrations while still young, receiving a blow on the forehead that left a lifelong scar. That small detail matters because it reminds us that for Nasser, the British presence was not an abstraction in a Foreign Office file. It was something felt physically, early, and personally. He entered the military, met the officers who would later form the Free Officers, and carried the resentment of 1948 when Arab armies failed against the newly created State of Israel. In 1952, Nasser and 89 other officers staged the coup that ousted King Farouk. He first ruled from the shadows, then emerged in 1954 as the real power, and by 1956 had reshaped Egypt into a one-party Arab socialist state with himself at the center. Britannica records that when Washington and London withdrew dam funding, Nasser answered within days by nationalizing the canal and promising that its revenues would fund the project. There was theater in that move, but there was also discipline. Nasser understood spectacle, he also understood accounts. He was not merely seizing a waterway. He was converting sovereignty into revenue and revenue into legitimacy. That made him a uniquely dangerous adversary for Britain. Eden wanted to see him as another interwar dictator, another aggressor to be faced down before weakness became catastrophe. Many around Eden viewed appeasement in the 1930s as the formative lesson of their generation, and they read Nasser through that lens. But Nasser was not Hitler, and Egypt was not Nazi Germany. He was a post-colonial officer-politician operating inside the new currents of decolonization, nationalism, development economics, and Cold War bargaining. He wanted arms where he could get them, he wanted infrastructure, he wanted prestige, he wanted the old imperial powers gone. That does not make him innocent, it does make him modern. He could talk about Arab dignity and dam finance in the same breath. He could nationalize a company and frame it as both anti-colonial justice and a development plan. When Britain looked at him, it saw a regional strongman. When much of the Arab world looked at him after Suez, it saw a man who had stared down Europe and survived. That was the real strategic disaster for London. Even defeat did not quite describe it. Nasser came out of the brief war, as Britannica puts it, with undiminished prestige. Britain came out of it with a diminished self-image. The crucial decision seen, then, is not just the cabinet argument in London or the troop movements in Egypt. It is the moment when the political and the financial fused. In Washington, officials were already thinking in these terms. The Dale Memorandum did not describe a passing inconvenience. It described a British government facing reserve losses, higher oil bills, debt repayments, and growing pressure on sterling. It urged U.S. officers to recognize the dangers of inaction and be ready to move when the British asked. Across the Atlantic, Macmillan grasped the essentials faster than some of his colleagues. The battlefield success at Port Said meant little if the pound could not be defended. The later summary that has Macmillan phoning Washington and being told that IMF backing depended on immediate withdrawal captures the whole shift in one bitter exchange. Whether one treats that moment as literal turning point or merely the sharpest symbol of a broader truth, it dramatizes something Eden never fully escaped. Britain could no longer separate strategy from solvency. One can imagine the room, maps on the table, reports from Egypt, telegrams from the United Nations, and somewhere in the middle of all that imperial clutter, the realization that the decisive theater was not the Canal Zone at all. It was New York, Washington, and every market where sterling could be sold before Monday morning. There is another thread running beside this one, and at first it seems like a separate crisis entirely. While Britain, France, and Israel were moving against Egypt, Soviet power was crushing the uprising in Hungary. This mattered enormously to Washington. The State Department's history notes that the Eisenhower administration opposed the invasion of Egypt partly because it wanted to avoid associating itself with European colonialism. At the same moment, it was condemning Soviet intervention in Hungary. In plain English, America could not defend freedom in Budapest while tolerating something that looked like old-style imperial coercion in Port Said. That parallel crisis is one reason Suez was never just a bilateral Anglo-Egyptian quarrel. It was a Cold War optics disaster. Eisenhower also feared Soviet intervention on Egypt's side. The Imperial War Museum notes that Nikita Khrushchev attacked British imperialism, threatened London with rockets, and raised the prospect of troops moving toward Egypt, with the danger of dragging NATO into something even uglier. So while British ministers were still thinking in terms of canal rights and prestige, Washington was looking at alliance coherence, anti-colonial politics, Soviet propaganda, and the wider architecture of the Cold War. These were not the same priorities, they were bound to collide. That collision also ran through the so-called special relationship. The Suez story is often told as a moment when Britain discovered that America was not sentimental. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. The relationship did survive. The State Department explicitly notes that by March 1957, under Harold Macmillan, the bilateral relationship had recovered. Yet survival is not the same as equality. Suez exposed the hierarchy inside the friendship. Britain still imagined consultation among near peers. America increasingly behaved like the creditor and strategic senior partner. That is humiliating not because alliances are fake, but because they are real and unequal. The friend on whom you rely most has the most leverage when you miscalculate. That is why the title of this story, with its image of one phone call from Washington, lands so hard. Not because empires literally vanish between one ring and the next, but because dependence reveals itself that suddenly. One moment you believe you are coordinating, the next you realize you are asking permission in the language of finance. Meanwhile, the domestic consequences inside Britain were immediate and corrosive. The Imperial War Museum describes the crisis as one of the most significant episodes in post-1945 British history. It highlighted Britain's declining status and confirmed it as a second-tier world power. Within the country, opinions split sharply. The government faced hostility from labor and divisions inside its own party. Anti-war protests spread. Civil servants resigned. Intervention had initially been popular, which is itself a useful reminder. Nations often approve of demonstrations of strength before they see the bill, but humiliation is a rapid educator. Once it became clear that Britain had won the opening military moves only to be forced into retreat under financial and diplomatic pressure, the operation no longer looked like resolve. It looked like theater without endurance. Even the practical effects were humiliating. The canal was closed to traffic for 5 months because ships had been sunk during the fighting. British access to fuel became limited. Petrol rationing was introduced in December 1956 and lasted until May 1957. That is the sort of irony history specializes in. Britain had moved to protect a strategic route tied to oil and influence. It ended by rationing petrol at home, and then there was Eden himself. Even without a full biographical file, the outline is stark enough. Britannica's summary of his career identifies the Suez Crisis as the defining catastrophe of his premiership and notes that it led to his resignation in January 1957. The Imperial War Museum describes him as left humiliated. The State Department says Washington's public censure helped contribute to his resignation. There is something almost tragic in Eden's role because he was not a cartoon imperialist from central casting. He came from the generation shaped by the failures of the 1930s, by the memory of dictators being underestimated, by the belief that weakness invited larger disasters. But the curse of serious historical memory is that it can be applied too rigidly. Eden's generation had learned the right lesson from one decade and the wrong lesson for another. He saw firmness as moral clarity. He did not sufficiently see that the world of 1956 was organized differently from the world of 1938. Military reputation no longer floated free from financial dependence. Anti-colonial nationalism could not be managed like a cabinet problem, and America, for all its alliance rhetoric, would not jeopardize its global strategy to rescue Britain from a self-inflicted crisis. Eden resigned less than 2 years after becoming Prime Minister. His fall was political, personal, and symbolic all at once. The contradiction at the center of Suez is what makes it such a powerful story. Britain was trying to defend its standing in the world by acting as though it still possessed unquestioned standing. It was trying to preserve prestige through an operation that publicly advertised its dependence. It was trying to discipline Nasser for unilateral defiance while itself colluding secretly with France and Israel. It was claiming order while helping produce panic. It was fighting for a canal partly justified by oil security while the crisis itself forced more costly dollar oil purchases. Most of all, it was acting as though military success could compensate for financial fragility. It could not. This is the twist that reorders everything. The empire did not fall at Suez because British soldiers suddenly became ineffective, or because Whitehall had no plans, or because London no longer understood force. It fell there in the narrower and more modern sense that Britain discovered force without liquidity was performance. The world had changed from one in which territory and ships guaranteed rank to one in which credit, reserves, institutions, and alliance management set the outer limits of state action. Britain had not fully noticed. Washington had. This is why historians keep returning to the economic side of the crisis. James Boughton's IMF history treats Suez as a landmark in the fund's own early life because Britain's predicament showed how monetary instability and high politics had fused in the post-war order. Diane Kuntz's emphasis on economic diplomacy captures Washington's method precisely. The Americans did not have to shout. They did not even have to invent new tools. The system itself was enough. Sterling was vulnerable. IMF support mattered. Oil purchases had to be financed in dollars. Reserves were leaving fast. Debt payments were coming due. In that setting, support and disapproval were not mood words. They were mechanisms. One begins to see why some later storytellers exaggerate the episode into a cinematic tale of America deliberately bankrupting the British Empire over a weekend. The exaggeration flatters the drama. The real story is less melodramatic and more unsettling. Britain's empire was not murdered by a single American gesture. It was revealed to be mortgaged. The weekend simply exposed the terms. The international consequences rippled outward for years. The Imperial War Museum notes that only Australia backed Britain while Pakistan threatened to leave the Commonwealth. Recently independent states read the crisis carefully. Many did not see a sophisticated legal dispute over a company and a canal. They saw European powers attempting to reverse an anti-colonial act by force. That was politically disastrous for Britain across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The museum also notes that what Britain had hoped to prevent, it instead guaranteed. Egypt kept control of the canal with American and UN support. The Soviet Union gained influence by posing as the friend of Arab nationalism. Khrushchev's stance helped place Moscow, at least temporarily, in the role of anti-imperial patron. Nasser, emboldened by survival, became even more prominent as a symbol across the Arab world and supported rebel causes in British territories. The canal eventually reopened in April 1957, but by then the deeper message had already spread. Britain still had bases, diplomats, and weapons, yet its claim to lead events in the region on its own terms had been punctured, perhaps irreversibly. Even the language historians use about Suez reveals its status. Keith Kyle titled his great history of the subject as Britain's End of Empire in the Middle East. That is not just a dramatic subtitle, it is an argument. Not that Britain ceased to matter overnight or that all imperial withdrawal can be compressed into 1 month, but that Suez was the moment when illusion and reality stopped overlapping. Before the crisis, Britain could still imagine a world in which prestige, alliance, and force might compensate for diminished resources. After it, the boundaries were harder to deny. The special relationship survived, but in a form increasingly defined by American primacy. Britain remained influential, but not as an autonomous imperial arbiter in the Middle East. The canal still mattered, but it no longer belonged to the strategic mythology of London. Suez was not the total end of British power. It was worse in some ways. It was the end of a particular British idea of power. Now, it is important to be careful here because Suez is one of those episodes that tempts people into cartoon history. The title says one phone call from Washington bankrupted the British Empire in a weekend. It is a strong title because it captures the emotional truth of the humiliation, but as history, it needs trimming. Britain was not literally bankrupted in one weekend. Nor was the outcome caused by a single phone call acting in isolation, as if one American official merely snapped his fingers and centuries of empire vanished. The British position had been weakened by much more than that. Post-war constraints, the structure of sterling, exposure to reserve losses, dependence on imported oil, the politics of decolonization, the the Cold War setting, and a catastrophic misreading of American priorities. Even the anti-colonial victory narrative around Nasser requires nuance. He was skillful and bold, but he also benefited from global circumstances beyond his control, especially American opposition to the invasion and Soviet eagerness to exploit it. So the credible version of this story is not conspiracy, it is contradiction. Britain attempted an old imperial solution in a new financial order and discovered that its freedom of action was narrower than its language suggested. That, in the end, is why Suez still feels contemporary. The names change, the currencies change, the institutions change, but the underlying truth is painfully durable. Great powers do not usually collapse because they forget how to use force. They collapse because they misunderstand the system in which force must operate. They keep speaking the language of command after the ledger has already shifted against them. They win the first move and lose the right to sustain it. They confuse possession with control and memory with capacity. In 1956, Britain still had maps colored by history, officers trained for intervention, and ministers who believed that one more decisive act might rescue status from decline. What it lacked was the financial independence required to turn those instincts into lasting policy. That is a harsh lesson, and not just for Britain. Any state that borrows credibility from a stronger patron eventually risks discovering that the patron's support is conditional. Any elite that mistakes yesterday's hierarchy for today's reality is already drifting toward humiliation. Empires rarely hear the music stop while they are still dancing. So when people remember Suez, they often picture the canal, the troops, the humiliation, Eden's resignation, Nasser's triumph. All of that belongs in the story. But listen more carefully and another sound emerges underneath it. The clatter of reserves leaving, the dry language of debt repayments, the quiet authority of the creditor, the short phone call that told London the age of imperial improvisation was over. Not because Britain had become irrelevant. Not because America wished to erase it, but because power had moved into forms less visible and more decisive. If you want the keyword for this story, let it be sterling, because that was the real battlefield. And if this is the kind of history you come here for, the kind where money and empire strip each other bare, stay with the channel. There are many more ruins to inspect, and most of them still insist they are standing.